In this episode, I am joined by Charles Manson, author of the Second Karmapa Karma Pakshi, published by Shambhala, and librarian for the Tibetan Collections at Oxford University's Bodleian Library and at the British Library. Charles begins by discussing the remarkable life of Karma Pakshi, the Second Karmapa, Tibet's oldest continuous reincarnation lineage. Charles traces Karma Pakshi's adventures as a yogic trainee, personal guru to Mongol Khans, figure of political intrigue, and reformer of monasteries. Charles goes on to tell the story of his own life, from brutal treatment at elite British boarding schools to undergraduate studies at the renowned Columbia University. Charles recounts how arrest and deportation saw his academic prospects dashed. After a period of homelessness, he became a master woodcarver, training under craftsmen in England and Germany. Charles recalls his encounter with Buddhism, his contact with spiritual teachers such as the 16th Karmapa, his reckoning with the untimely death of his son's mother, and details his experiences undertaking 8 years of closed retreat, including challenging group dynamics, the painful complications of energetic yogas, and the mechanisms of spiritual transformation. Charles also discusses his remarkable time with the Tibetan Karma Rinpoche, receiving sacred Chulen instructions and witnessing the Mahasiddha miraculously press a footprint into rock, as well as Charles' own return to academia, with postgraduate studies at Harvard and long-standing work at Oxford University and the British Library. So without further ado, Charles Manson. Charles Manson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so delighted to be talking with you today, and I must say congratulations on your new publication, Second Karmapa Karma Pakshi, part of the Lives of the Masters series published by Shambhala. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yes, a labor of love.
And I understand it was quite some years in the making. It includes very detailed, and I think, well, I don't know if there's been in the past such a comprehensive survey, if you like, of Karma Pakshi's life as this. And then the second half of the book, lots of translations of various writings of and about Karma Pakshi. So what can you say about this book, and can you say something about how it came to be?
Well, on a sort of longish journey of my life, at some point I went into Buddhist retreat for 8 years. It was a group retreat. Firstly, with I think it was 6 or 7 people, and then the second, that was 4 years, and then the second 4 years was it was 20 or so. Yeah, it's about 30 years ago now. And during that, we did what was known as a Karma Pakshi Guru Yoga. And I derived considerable benefit from that. And afterwards, I thought I'd look more into his life. It was something interesting to me. And I started off in a fairly sort of superficial way, shall we say, just looking at the more recent accounts, and then gradually got deeper and deeper into it, and then found that he'd actually written some memoirs, which nobody had looked at much. They're not easy to look at. The manuscript, the actual manuscript's fine, but the language, perhaps, and the way that they're written too. And so I started work on that, and also looking at some of his other writings as well. And then later I found it was only in 2015, I think, this was made available, a manuscript coming out of Tibet that contained 40 odd of his songs, which people hadn't known about. So I included that in the book as well, some of them anyway, I think about 10 or so. And also earlier in 2010, I had found in an sort of research trip in China and Nepal and India, I come across another manuscript that listed what it purported to say, that the reincarnations that he had told people about, which again hadn't been known about widely anyway. I found this manuscript in a lama's kitchen in East Tibet. And so that was also quite interesting. That informed the book to a certain extent as well. And that's really how it, and then it was just, the work of working on it, really. That's how it came about.
Very interesting. I'm curious about the difficulty of the autobiography, the so-called Rang Namtar. Although perhaps I've realized I ought to ask you, who was, briefly, Karma Pakshi? Why is he so significant? And then I'd like to know what it was about the Rang Namtar in particular that presented difficulty.
Yes. Well, Karma Pakshi was born in the 13th century, at the beginning of it, either 1204 or 1206. And he lived until 1283. And it was at a time when the reincarnation tradition or system, but tradition is probably better, had hardly begun in Tibet. There had been some people who had either been said of them, he is a reincarnation, or had actually declared themselves as reincarnations. But it hadn't become it hadn't developed very well at all, the continuity. And also what was quite noticeable was that these were adults that were, this was being identified. So it wasn't a child yet. And it was him that was first intimated that he was a reincarnation of a person who had actually died about 15 years beforehand. So that was quite unusual. And he also then practiced very extensively near a place called Batang, up in the mountains there, and eventually gathered quite a lot of students around him. This was a long retreat of about 13 years or so. And then he became, well known as a meditator, and he started to repair monasteries of his predecessor, the one who had died 13, 14, 15 years before. And he then gained a reputation. And as it happened, Kublai Khan, the great Mongol emperor, he was not yet an emperor, he was a prince at this time, a warrior prince. He happened to pass along East Tibet, Western China, twice on a military expedition. And he must have heard about Karma Pakshi, and he sent a messenger to Karma Pakshi to ask him to come to the court. And after some doubt about this, he writes a little bit about, whether he should come or whether he should go. He does go to the court in northeast China, I suppose, northwest China, northeast Tibet. And they get on quite well. But then Karma Pakshi has an intimation, a vision, that there's going to be trouble at the court. And he decides to leave. And he spends some more time in that area. But then Mongol Khan, Kublai Khan's elder brother, who is actually emperor, and he was, in fact, engaging in military, invasion and so forth, way over in Ukraine, in Kiev and Hungary and so forth. This would have been about 15 years earlier, in the 1240s. We're now up to about 1255 or so. So Karma Pakshi is a middle-aged man. And Mongol Khan he must have presumably heard about this teacher from who was at his younger brother's court, he sent for him to come to Karakoram in Mongolia, the center of this world empire. He went right across from Korea, way across to Krakow, I suppose, or almost that far, but certainly Hungary. And this time he didn't have doubts about it, or he doesn't express them anyway. And he crossed the Gobi Desert and he arrived at Karakoram. And as I explain a little bit in the book, it's there that he comes to a realization, again, a sort of further realization about his being a reincarnation. Because the previous Karmapa, he wasn't known as a Karmapa yet. This was Dusum Khenpa. And Karma Pakshi was the first person to be called, or he called himself Karmapa. The previous Dusum Khenpa, his previous incarnation, had made some predictions. He was well known for making predictions about future lives and also discussing past lives to his disciples. We have records of this. And his disciples at some point, a lot of the, not prediction, yes, predictions, yes, about future lives, had been way off in the future. And they asked him quite naturally, well, we'd like to know when you're going to be reborn next, because, we have attachment to you. And he gave 3 examples, and none of them fitted with Karma Pakshi's situation. So he knew about these predictions. They'd been written down. Karma Pakshi knew. And he... So one, far off in the west, and one down in the south, but the third one was that he would be reborn for the sake of one person, and this contradicts the Mahayana principle that if you have any control or influence over a future rebirth, I mean, constantly the bodhicitta vow, the bodhisattva vow, is that I will act through life after life for the sake of all beings. And to be reborn for the sake of one being does seem a bit contradictory. And it was as Karma Pakshi was approaching the nerve center of the empire, that it came to him that, this is what he meant, was that if I can influence this emperor who has influence over so many people across the world, then this would be highly beneficial. And he does meet the emperor. They get on very well. He gives the emperor initiation. He gives him advice about social policies, which Karma Pakshi claims anyway he did follow. He even advises him about preventing killing of animals on certain days of the month, which for a Mongolian warrior emperor would seem a bit unusual, but he did issue an edict. We have separate records about that, about not killing animals on certain days of the month. But it was rather short-lived, because Monge was still a warrior at heart, so to speak. Apparently he was quite a good meditator. According to Karma Pakshi, he was really impressed with his meditation abilities and understanding. But Monge was still committed to his grandfather's commitment to conquer China. China had been disunified for some centuries now. And Genghis Khan, the grandfather, the famous Genghis Khan, he had actually died in northern China in trying to, conquer or unify, whichever way you want to put it, China. And it was sort of considered an obligation, perhaps, to continue that legacy. So Monge decided to go, he assembled his forces. His younger brother was ready to, in China as well. And they were going to do, a sort of pincer movement. And he went south to begin this, but Karma Pakshi left Mongol Khan and went further west and saw another branch of the family over in Yining. But he wasn't very successful. They were more inclined towards Islam than Buddhism. And then he eventually returned and he caught up again with Mongol Khan in northern China. And it was not that long afterwards that Mongol Khan actually died while on campaign. He got ill down in sort of mid-China. So to a certain extent, that left Karma Pakshi not involved with the Mongol courts anymore. And he was continuing his preaching, repairing stupas and monasteries in northern China area. So Mongia died, and both Kublai Khan and the younger brother, the Arik Burke, who had been in Mongolia at the court when Karma Pakshi was there, they both declared themselves as the emperor of emperor, the Kagan of Khans, and claiming to be emperor of the whole region. And this led to a kind of civil war. And Kublai Khan had been rather upset, apparently, about Karma Pakshi leaving earlier when he'd left the court. And he apparently thought that he was part of Arik Burke's court or side of this argument. And so he issued a death warrant against Karma Pakshi, several, in fact. But none of them worked. And there's, I go into it to a certain extent in the book. It's been perhaps, well, I imagine it's been embellished somewhat as legend a bit, but the core story is that he wanted him killed, but he couldn't seem to kill him. And in fact, the executioner himself presumably got rather frustrated or upset about this and committed suicide himself. And then Kublai Khan decided, well, I'll rescind this death warrant, this death order, and just put him in internal exile. It was a regular punishment in those days. And he sent him to nearby a lake, a sort of barren area, which happened to have a lake. And this would be in northeast China. And so for the duration of this civil war, Karma Pakshi was in northeast. These are huge distances he's crossing by horse or walking. And he spent a couple of years there writing and having visions and so forth, very much on his own, not entirely alone, but not amongst people. He didn't do preaching and so forth. And then the civil war was resolved. Kublai Khan was declared the Kagan of Khans. And he then called Karma Pakshi to the Beijing area. Beijing was not yet Beijing, but to that area where it was later created by Kublai Khan. And he imprisoned him there in a temple. And even though this is in Karma Pakshi's memoirs, even though the doors were nailed shut and there was a 24-hour guard around it, he escaped. Apparently the walls were dissolved and he got out. And this seemed to change Kublai Khan's mind. And he then asked him to be his teacher again. But I think Karma Pakshi was getting on quite a bit now. He was in his 60s. He'd had enough of all this, and he decided to, he had safe passage now. He decided to go back to Tibet. And he had a considerable amount of wealth now. Mongol Khan had given him wealth. He still seemed to have it. And there's not a direct record of Kublai Khan giving him much, but perhaps he had. So he came back to Tibet, first to East Tibet, where he was born, and had some monasteries, repaired them again, or increased and enhanced them, built statues, and then another long journey to central Tibet, near Lhasa, to the monastery Tsopu, where he proceeded to build a huge statue. I mean, really huge, 60 feet high, which for those days must have been incredibly difficult. You had to get the ore first, the iron ore or the metal, and then you had to, melt it and so forth. I don't know, was it coal or charcoal? It doesn't go into a lot of detail. I think there was a mine of copper nearby as well, and mix it with copper. And eventually he built it. This was because he had an instruction in a dream vision some years before, when he was on his travels, to he had a vision of a huge Buddha, to create a statue. And he did it, and he consecrated it, and apparently it was very beneficial to people. And then we come to the last part of his life. And so he built this statue, and very quickly, or very soon, it became a source of pilgrimage, as one can imagine, something this huge in remote central Tibet. And there was a party that came from the south of Tibet. And in this party, a party of pilgrims, there was an itinerant potter and his wife. And they came, to see the statue, and then go on to Lhasa, where there was also a very famous holy statue of Sakyamuni Buddha. But they came, and as they was there, at some point, Karma Pakshi, who must have been quite a figure in those days, and all his stories and his miraculous events and his visions, and he was the teacher of 2 emperors, after all. So he just calls aside this itinerant potter, and he asks him, he said, at some time, I need to borrow your dwelling. And this was very peculiar, as you might imagine. So the poor potter goes back to his fellow pilgrims and says, this great Lama who built the statue and so forth. Well, I don't know exactly what he says, but I'm extrapolating a little bit. But one can imagine it quite reasonably. He's asked to borrow my house. And they all just, well, this is recorded, they just burst out laughing because, as they said, you're an itinerant potter, you have no house. Well, it so happens that a year later, his wife gives birth to the child that becomes Karma Pakshi's reincarnation, or is recognized as Karma Pakshi's reincarnation. So in a sense, perhaps Karma Pakshi was preparing the ground there. You can interpret it how you wish, but it does seem that it, a fairly reasonable way of looking at it. And that, I would suggest, is the third. First, as a child, he's told that he's a reincarnation. Then he sort of confirms it in his own mind when he goes to the court in Karakoram. And then he makes sure that the next reincarnation is discovered at the age of 5 by a yogin, a traveling yogin, who Karma Pakshi gives instructions to, so that he can pass on the instructions to the next Karmapa, who is known as Rangjung Dorji, the 3rd Karmapa. And therefore, afterwards, I suppose you could say by the time of the 4th Karmapa, the lineage is really settled in a way. And it becomes really obligatory to find this snake. And the 4th Karmapa, it's said in the histories that when he was a child, he declares I am Karmapa. And then the people come and find him and confirm this. So that's one way in which Karma Pakshi is extremely important in a way. He starts off the oldest continuous reincarnation lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. A couple of centuries later, there's the Dalai Lama tradition starts, and then eventually another couple of centuries, in the 17th century, the Dalai Lamas become head of government, and they rule for 300 years until the communists come. So he's important in that way. I do deal in the book with certain degrees of his legacy. And it's also, yeah, well, I think we'll stop there. Please carry on.
I also asked about the difficulty of the Rang Namtar, but let's
yes,
pick up the tulku issue to begin with here. So this is what sometimes called now this tulku system, although you prefer tradition. And in the book, Second Karmapa Karma Pakshi, you write, various beliefs in rebirth have been, and still are, widespread across many religions and philosophies. But Tibetan culture is unique in having integrated the belief into the socio-religious administration of cultural centers, such as Buddhist monasteries. So I wonder if you might say a little something about that blossoming reincarnation tradition. Did it move from merely a sense of spiritual potency being transferred or spiritual authority being transferred into the administrative lands and monasteries and that sort of inheritance as well, the material inheritance, if you want, or the temporal authority? Did it move from a sort of spiritual significance to a sort of a temporal authority significance, or did it always have something of an aspect of inheriting a fiefdom also?
Yeah, it took a while. I think it has been studied to a certain extent, but I think perhaps it needs more study of the whatever legal or quasi-legal arrangements there were about how property is transferred in this way, and also the financial arrangements too. Of course, there aren't that many records. How many records of financial arrangements do we have for medieval Europe? We do have them, of course, but it's and property arrangements. So in fact, there was a sort of tension for a while in Karma Pakshi's case, that he seemed to have quite easily assumed the leadership, if not, I wouldn't call it maybe ownership, but leadership anyway, of the monasteries of Dusum Khenpa, his predecessor, despite him having been dead for quite a while. And because by the time Karma Pakshi is an adult and has finished retreat, he's in his 50s. So it's 50, 60 years later, this impressive person turns up and says, I'm going to regenerate this monastery. But when he does this in central Tibet, at Tsopu, which is where Dusum Khenpa died, he doesn't actually, when Karma Pakshi dies later, it doesn't pass to disciples, the ownership. It stays in the family, and it doesn't actually go to Rangjung Dorji. So there's a sort of tension there. And at some point later, there's actually a book done by Ruth Campbell in the same series about the third Karmapa. And that's very interesting too. He doesn't, so yeah, it stays within his family. So in a sense, it hasn't actually, or it's his nephews and so forth that run the monastery there. So it's not entirely worked out that, oh, all the property then goes to the next reincarnation. Not yet, anyway. This may happen later, but I'm not well versed in the actual nitty-gritty of those sort of practical arrangements. But certainly the third Karmapa then goes to Tsopo and eventually gets accepted there. But it's not entirely smooth yet. I think it takes a little bit of time for this to happen. I think we tend to, looking back, we tend to think, oh, it's an institution, there are rules and regulations for institutions, and to transfer of property and also authority as well is laid down with rules. That's how we kind of do things. We tend to, in our personal lives, it goes from one generation to the next, and we have wills and so forth. In institutions, it can go from perhaps from one teacher to the next, or from one disciple to the next in a religious context, or it can be but through election amongst either a lot of people or just the sort of elite of the institution. In the case of the Pope, for instance, he's elected through inspiration, shall we say, from God. But in this case, it's people who knew the previous incarnation, and received transmission. They go looking for the child. The next child, and then they declare that, and sometimes it doesn't work out. As we know, there's a controversy at the moment that two people who knew the previous Karmapa very well then declared different people as being the next Karmapa. This has happened in the past as well. Usually it gets resolved eventually. But it's rather unfortunate, but it's a bit nebulous, isn't it? You can't, there is no mechanism for actual vote. It's a matter of people coming to a general consensus.
And how were such situations resolved in the past? One presumes assassination.
No.
No.
I don't know. I haven't looked at that side. My interest was has been, what still is, the beginnings of it. I mean,
yeah, fair enough.
To my mind, having been a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner for quite a while, the 50 years, and we have this reincarnate lamas and so forth. I just thought, well, how did this all start? Where does it come from? Okay, the Buddhist belief in reincarnation, but then you've got this sort of system, I suppose, or tradition, and and also the Karma Pakshi is quite important in a retreat context, in the Kagyu tradition anyway, as a guru yoga, because in the 17th century there was somebody who had a vision, Mingyo Tulku, there is a Mingyo Tulku current, who's a very well-known and respected teacher. His previous 17th century incarnation had a vision of Karma Pakshi, and this got written down as a practice. He was given instructions from this vision, which I've translated in the book, and the instructions, not the whole practice. And that practice is also very important. So there was a combination of the reincarnation sort of intrigue, shall we say, or curiosity, the beginnings of it, and also the fact that he was a very important figure for Kagyu Tibetan Buddhism practice. I just wanted to make information available to people, because I think you said there weren't many. There's been no extensive look at his life. There's been some, short, usually as part of the lineage, these short descriptions. I wanted to look at it more closely, and I looked at his memoirs. Now, you said why, in what way was it difficult? Well, his style of writing, I haven't got any reason to believe that it isn't his writing, but you can't confirm it absolutely. It's not in his handwriting. It was written as a copy much later. But when you read it, there are sort of bits and pieces of it, of the memoirs, and it may well be that he was dictating to a close disciple. He may have actually written some. It is quite a bit of it's in the first person, or he refers to himself as a name as well. Rangjung Dorji, he calls himself, which becomes the name of the next incarnation. He refers to himself as Karmapa as well, which Dusum Kempa hadn't been referred to. And actually, I'm told, I did ask Ruth Campbell, who looked into the next Karmapa's life, that the third Karmapa didn't refer to himself as Karmapa either. Or he may have done once in his writings, but it wasn't general as a title yet, until probably the fourth Karmapa. And the difficulty was, well, it's in handwriting, so you then got to interpret it. You know about Tibetan a bit. And when people, you do it, you general people, when you're writing, sometimes you use abbreviations. And in Tibetan, likewise, for very common terms like Buddha and so forth, it gets abbreviated. Well, there's something like 300 different types of abbreviation in this. So you have to work those out as well. And then the way that he writes, as well, he's a Mahasiddha. That's the subtitle of the book. So it's very sort of full on, really. Sometimes the language gets quite mystical, and some people may find some of my translation slightly obscure in a way, or hard to understand. I think what I've found, anyway, for myself, I hope this is valid for others, is that if you sort of cogitate on it a bit, chew it over mentally, some kind of understanding does come. It may just be poor translation, of course, but I think that sometimes it just needs a bit of sitting with it, because this is somebody who's quite unusual writing, who's not necessarily a great clear writer. His reincarnation, Rangjung Dorji, is very, I would say anyway, quite easy to understand and very clear and sort of logical in that way, step by step. But Karma Pakshi is more sort of intuitive, should we say.
The second Karmapa Karma Pakshi, it's really fantastic. Slim, but dense. And it goes at some pace. He's had an exciting life. He had a real adventure, and it rockets along at quite a pace. So it's really fantastic. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's pivot, shall we? You were born in Venezuela.
Yes. As predicted.
Exactly.
For the sake of one person.
You mean the one listener to this podcast, probably?
Yes. Oh dear. Yes. Yes. My father was an engineer. He'd been in the Second World War as a Royal Engineer in Burma and then in Italy and so forth. And then he joined after he was very young then. He'd left university to join up and then went back to university. And he'd decided to join up with Shell Oil. And so he went for training in Amsterdam. And there he met my mother. And then he got posted to Venezuela. As far as I know, that's when the sort of oil in Venezuela was really beginning to take off in the Maracaibo and Bachquero areas, the lake, the lake at the top of South America. And yeah, I was born. It was quite sort of pioneering in a way for these people. They, apparently my dad used to come back from work, covered in oil and stuff. And my mother said that she gave birth to me in Maracaibo in the hospital there. And he was actually in the field. And she went to join him with this new child and had to be flown there by helicopter. And she was still, this was a week old, I think. I was a week old. She said getting out of the helicopter, she was still a little bit sore, shall we say, was extremely painful. So I grew up, yes, for the first 8 years or so. I was, well, let's say 12 years, but I was back and forth quite a bit. We did spend some time in Houston, again, connected with oil, in 54, 55, because the offshore drilling was just beginning in those days. And my father went, it's quite fortunate for him in a way. He got sent there and was part of that offshore drilling. It had been happening in off California too. We went very briefly to California. Presumably he was retraining to a certain extent. So we spent, my first school was in Houston, Texas, where they made you, when we had breaks, they made you lie down. I just couldn't lie down. I was very fidgety. So that's my vague memory of first school. And then we went back to Maracaibo, and presumably with my father's knowledge, training for offshore drilling helped in that. Then they could drill within the lake at Maracaibo. But they didn't particularly appreciate it, so they kept on asking if, so we're into the 60s now, if they could return to Europe, because and as it happened, the offshore drilling was just beginning in Europe. And so he had a good case to put, I know about offshore drilling. Why can't I be part of this? So he was part of the British-Norwegian effort in getting oil out of the North Sea. So that's really, the background there.
My father also worked for Shell, by the way, as a navigator. Yeah,
we're brothers in oil.
Your father then might have based himself out of Shetland at some point. The Sulumvo, the terminal there, the largest oil terminal in the Northern Hemisphere. I grew up on the Shetland Islands, so
oh gosh,
possible that.
When was this? When?
Let's think. I suppose 86 to 05,
80s,
something like that.
Yeah, by that time he was actually beginning to be semi-retired, I think. Yeah. And he just worked. What happened is we were in Holland for quite a bit. That's when he came back to Europe. It wasn't to the UK, it was to Holland, to Shell there. And then got involved a little bit. We were in Norway, and I was carrying on with education in UK. Shell would pay for boarding school. And Uh, by that time, he was based in London. He would occasionally go up to Aberdeen, but only as a sort of day trip to see people and check on things perhaps, or decide on a new. But he sort of was risen up to a certain extent, and then 80s he was semi-retired, and just advising. Really, it sort of got fairly lucrative advisor positions by that time.
You mentioned boarding school there.
Mm.
Now, you went to a couple of different boarding
Yes.
schools, prep schools and boarding schools.
Yes.
But you've said that your education, to quote you, wasn't a great experience at all. In fact, you described Bryanston Elders as a fairly dreadful place.
Yes.
And that your experiences there were before some of the famous reforms in those places. That there was I suppose, waves of reform that have occurred, and you were just before a big wave of that reform. I'm wondering if you might say something about what sort of education you had there, what and why was it so unpleasant? Could you say something more about that period?
Yeah, I think my perception, when you think about it, looking back, some of it may come from the fact that I first went to school in the United States. And if you think, I started at boarding school in cold. I've been in hot countries, living in a swimming pool type of thing. And you come to this cold country, and both, emotionally cold as well. In the 50s, you imagine what England was like in the 50s. It wasn't that great. And so it was a bit of a shock in that way. The way and the sort of authority, the way that they beat people, the fact that they weren't professionals, these teachers. They just, anybody who got appointed at these private schools could teach. There were sort of ex-colonels who presumably, I don't know, and then there was a certain amount of abuse as well, which I was fortunate not to be a party to, but you saw it, and that's not good either. To a certain extent, we've become more alive to this and condemn it more nowadays. In those days, maybe, it's very dirty stuff. And that's really, the actual teaching, the intellectual sort of journey, that was okay. Yeah. I did have my mind open to a certain extent. I'd had, all you need is one good teacher, they say. And yeah, it was very good. But the authoritarianism, I couldn't deal with it. I think, I had a problem with it because of my previous American influence, perhaps. I don't know, but that's my interpretation anyway. It continued into the public school as well, the sort of secondary school. Again, the authoritarianism. I got beaten. I think I probably hold the school record twice in 2 days for absolutely trivial things. It's just, I think it's kind of revolting, really. And again, they weren't, this was your secondary education, and it was just people who'd been to Oxford or Cambridge or got a degree, and then it was assumed that they could teach. And I'm not sure that they could, really. Sorry to be so negative, but I didn't like it at all.
So those schools are said to be, particularly the first one that you attended, sort of forming schools in a way for empire, for people to go off to the Raj or something like that, and yes. And be in charge of something or other. And so they were geared towards that and geared towards affecting the students in a certain way that they'd be useful, I suppose, agents of empire in those days. And there is a model of boarding school syndrome, by the way, an ABCD model, and it says abandonment, bereavement, captivity, and then dissociation. Abandonment, of course, because one goes to boarding school, and though one's parents may have the best of intentions, in a sense, you're separated from them. So there can be a sense of terrible abandonment, and the way that emotional response is dealt with in those kind of environments can be quite brutal by the institution and also by the other pupils, of course. And bereavement, of course. And then there's the captivity, which you've pointed to.
Yes.
And it's the forced submission to even trivial exercising of authority, for its own sake almost. And then dissociation, the coping, in other words, that one learns to cope with that somehow. I wonder if any of that resonates. And what do you think, if anything, was the intention, or what was the goal behind that sort of authoritarianism? Was there much design or intelligence behind it, do you think? No.
Yeah. Not that I could perceive, anyway. It's just outrageous. Yeah, there's a sort of meanness,
Why?
Yeah, it's hard to fathom. It's hard to fathom. You can't go back in time and ask these people, but it was structured that way, and it worked to a certain extent, in the sense that this small country had such big influence across the world. But there's both good and bad. Intellectually, I don't think I was stymied there. In terms of coping, well, one way of coping is to be rebellious. I would take my rebellion quite, what should we say, within limits. It wasn't completely outrageous, but I became, I think I'm right in saying, known as a bit of a rebel type. And I also, it meant the way of dealing with it was sort of intellectually get involved with my subject matter. Anyway, that was my eventual resolution of it, I suppose, within myself. I used to spend quite a bit of time. Somebody who was, really quite sociable, gregarious, was on my school reports. But I would spend time alone in the library. Really alone, because those other boys, it was a boys' school, didn't really. I would be the only one in the library there. And I would write essays for, there would be a prize in your year for something. Nobody else, well, rarely somebody else would go in for these things, and I would. I won, because I was really the only person. But I think perhaps, some of the things were okay. I wrote one on the Crusades at the age of 15, and then something about Gothic architecture, sort of medieval interests, which persisted, you could say, transferred to Tibet. And so that was a kind of way of dealing with it. I was very sociable, I was breaking rules by going to the pub and that sort of thing, smoking and, getting into trouble for those things, answering back at times. But it wasn't, I never took it to extremes, really. So I didn't get expelled. I just, I tested the boundaries, should we say. Yes.
And I'm curious, did any of that stay with you?
Well, you sort of, why should I have got interested in Tibetan Buddhism? I suppose it was a sort of questioning, because I questioned this authority. I certainly didn't abide by it. I didn't think I got put in any. Yeah, I did for a short while, I think. I can't remember now, but I got put in any position of authority. Maybe I wasn't. I did, in sport. That was another outlet as well. Actually, I was quite good at sport, well coordinated with ball and bat and that sort of thing. I was captain of a hockey team and played well in. I liked teamwork actually. That was so I wasn't an isolated person in that way, but I wasn't really. Yeah, I was sort of part of the team, but there was an element of not being part of the team. And I suppose to a certain extent, that kind of journey or approach, in a way, in a psychological sense, may have helped attract me to Tibetan Buddhism. There was a series of coincidences as well, the attraction to Tibetan Buddhism, because I came to it quite early. I think it was 21, 22, something like that. Whereas often people come to it a bit later on.
And that pivot to the intellectual as a coping mechanism, is that because that was a sphere in which you could exercise agency and potency, or what was the mechanism there? Do you know?
I've always liked reading. And we didn't have television in Venezuela. And I used to read a lot. We kind of had to read. You have this huge stack of comics. Wish I had them now, but worth a fortune. American DC comics and so forth. And I'd read books a lot. And I suppose it was the reading. Yeah, I just liked reading, and you can get into a space with reading, which another world perhaps. And then I found that actually you could research as well, and that was very. So although I read literature, I wouldn't consider myself well read in literature, but I liked the combination of literature and facts with that history offers, and that you can research it. And that sort of stayed with me, I suppose.
Yeah, I can see that in this.
Yes.
It's fact after fact after fact, but
Yes.
written in such a accessible narrative sense to it. It has a great pace to it, and a great sense of energy and excitement to it. But and one almost overlooks the density of facts that are presented there, especially they haven't been collected together like that before. There hasn't been such an extensive review of that material, and it is remarkable array of information you've gathered there and put it together in such a narrative. It's great. Yeah, I can see that penchant expressing itself.
Well, that's that's my intention, and I'm quite relieved that that seems to have come across. The reviews have been positive. I'm waiting for that band review. I don't wish to invite it, but please don't just do a band review for the sake of it. But if there is genuine, I see the faults in the book, but and the research too. Well, hopefully I see all the faults, but it's just it's just very, very nice that people seem to like it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's no wonder. It's no wonder. So at that time, you also have said that you had an inclination, a sort of spark of interest towards religion, rising early and attending communion, Anglican communion, even though it wasn't when it wasn't compulsory. Of course, there was a compulsory aspect, I'm sure.
Yes.
And that you've also said actually that had you had better explanation or guidance there, perhaps, or example maybe, then you might have gone more in that direction.
Yes, could well have been. Yeah.
What do you imagine that direction to have could have been or would have been? What do you think
Hmm.
of when you say that?
Hmm. Well, I did, this sort of rebellious child, a boy, in a uh, teenager, should we say. Um, and yet he would get up early and go to communion for a while. This went on for about a year. I suppose it was a kind of searching. Yeah. I was looking for, I didn't really understand. And the priest at the school wasn't, I don't know, he didn't really explain things terribly well. It was all kind of functional and so forth. Um, I think maybe if I had, come across somebody who was more uh, spiritual, should we say, not to be unkind, uh, then I may well have stuck with that. May well have, become a sort of unusual priest or something, a slightly different priest, not part of the mainstream, should we say? But I just didn't connect really with the Christian teaching so much. I did read quite a bit about it and so forth, but in the end, I didn't. No, my interest left me,
Mm.
I suppose. And then there was a sort of searching period, and I suppose you could say that I found Tibetan Buddhism. I didn't leap into that immediately either. It was a sort of quite a gradual process.
Yes. You orbited it for quite some time, didn't
Yes, yes, that's true.
we'll get
Yes.
there. So
Mm,
after graduating
mm,
secondary school,
mm.
you found your way to Colombia.
Yes, yes, yes. So I applied to Oxford. I worked quite hard, and I got some decent A levels. The I mm, Yeah, I didn't get into Oxford anyway, which people were surprised about. And so I got a scholarship an exchange scholarship to the States, to a school in Connecticut. And from there, I applied to Columbia and got um, I think it was a scholarship again, where quite a bit of it was paid for, and went there. And of course, right in the tumult of Columbia students and the Vietnam War and so forth. So it was quite a time. Yeah, quite a time, quite exciting, uh, and it didn't bode well for studying. Actually, you sort of got involved in the social movements of the time more, and didn't sort of, in a sense, went a little bit off course, should we say?
You did, or the university did?
I did. Yes. The university, I think it was fine. Yes, as far as I know, I don't know. There was, uh, yeah, yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it actually. It was, I just felt better about how things were organized, coming from this rather old-fashioned public school system. And the first day that I was there, we sat on Columbia has this square. There's a sort of lawn type in New York City, as a group of students with a teacher. And we started looking at this was in 1969, the poetry of Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was living down the road on near Washington Square, and this was just tremendous to me. It was so alive and real and honest as well. Whereas I'd come from this peculiar system that was back there. I must say that only 5 years later, I went back to a brief visit to just have a look. I turned up on a motorbike and at this school, and the boy, they were in jeans and the hair was longer and things had changed fairly rapidly. I was, in a sense, I was a victim, well, not a victim, but of the last bit of that unpleasant, sort of closed, tight system that they had.
In England?
Yes. Sorry. Yes. I went to Columbia. Yeah.
I'm curious which sorts of causes you got involved with. I think I know a couple of them, but I'm curious which ones.
Yeah. Well, this is another thing that the English system, I had found anyway. I wasn't aware of it until then, but I did no biology. Not a single course in biology. How can you go through schooling without doing any? We had sex education, sure, but I didn't do a single course. I did Latin ad infinitum, but no biology. You can't do that. And so we were required to do the American system, certain courses that are out, sort of a little bit out with your chosen area, to get a more rounded education. So I remember doing astronomy, and that just, just blew my mind. The distances involved, and looking at that, I hadn't really thought. This was, shortly after man had first landed on the moon, and the other one was, I think, 17th century European music. I mean, it made you, a broader person, I suppose. But in terms of, studying medieval history, the American students were just way behind, so to speak, because you'd done this narrow system. I mean, there's arguments for both ways, I suppose, but it was quite exciting. Yeah. And then there was all the social stuff as well. New York City in 1969, 1970. Yeah.
How was that scene?
Oh, dear. It's unusual. It's a bit like a dream now. But there was a certain degree of unpleasantness as well. I mean, we had the art. Oh, I did, sculpture as well, which then fed into becoming a woodcarver later. But the art school was, I think, 4 or 5 blocks away from the main campus. So you'd have to walk down to there. And at one point, one of the female students got raped in the doorway there. And so people had to be escorted. And you weren't supposed to go to Harlem at all. It was just, I mean, it was very rough, very rough. The community relations weren't good at all. They still. So it was, New York was having a bad time at that time. Yeah.
You joined the Black Panthers, didn't you?
Briefly, yes. Yes. Oh dear, they were rather shocked to start with when I turned up and said, "Can I join?" And they kind of, yes, but to their credit, they said yes. Do if you want to. Yeah. So I sat in on a few meetings, but then I got distracted into other things. Yeah. And also there was beginning to be certain degree of fighting, going on. So yeah, that was when I wasn't so keen on it. Yeah. But yeah, I don't say that as a big thing. It's a bit of a funny story. That's all.
And when I think of 60s and I think of America and so on, I also think of the psychedelic,
Sure.
Movement.
Mm.
Were you involved in that at all?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Quite not super strongly, I would say. And I was fortunate that I didn't lose. It was a bit a sort of repetition of that, being at school and being something of the rebel, but not taking it too far. There's always, fortunate, some people really lost their way. But yeah, to a certain extent, I overdid it sometimes, but never to a point of losing your way. I'd still kept the idea of continuing with studies if possible. And yeah, I had some fairly imaginative experiences. And I had a really nice experience just recently, actually, with an old friend. Maybe I should have mentioned this. Those school days in England, I don't keep up with anybody from there. Never kept up with any of them at all. And that's not like me saying, oh, I don't wish to. It's just, there was no connection, really. I did turn up. There was a thing in the city of a sort of reunion type thing. And I went there and I just couldn't talk to anybody. It was it's very peculiar. They're different. Anyway, I was talking just recently last year in New York with a friend. Was it this year? I think it was last year, from Colombia, old days. And we'd had taken a few psychedelic trips together. And he'd since become a theatre director, and Roman Paska is his name, Paska, not Pakshi, and the puppet theatre and so forth. A very imaginative person. And he said that those experiences were very influential on him and his work later. And I thought that was really nice. But anyway, yes, part of that, and that sort of hippie scene. Yes.
Yes, you were on a kind of track there. It's a sort of classic track.
Yes.
Going to such an institution as Columbia, of course, very highly esteemed place. And at that time, involved in those kinds of explorations, it's a certain track, it's a certain pathway.
Yes.
And we can say in hindsight now, looking back, I think.
Yeah, sure.
But you were to be thrown from that pathway quite abruptly.
Yes. Brutally.
Yep.
Yes. Well, I had a very lovely girlfriend, Canadian artist girlfriend at Columbia. And we decided during the summer break to head west, as people did. So we went in a Volkswagen bus, and we went up through Canada. Went up to Montreal and across, because she was from Winnipeg. So we stopped off to see her mother. We were with a group of people, and we ended up in Vancouver. And that's when, perhaps to a certain extent, I kind of lost the track of education and so forth. I would have gone back, yes, but circumstances intervened. Became very now, what was it? We went to Vancouver, and it was a very nice scene there, and Vancouver Island and Salt Spring Island, before the Tibetan Buddhists came there. And actually, I did at one point write to my father and said, I'd like to get some land in Salt Spring Island, and because it was going for $1,000 or something, and build a place there. Young man wanting to do this, and he agreed to it, actually. But we came back to winter was coming, and so we went into, where was it? The capital of the island. I think it's Victoria. It's called, to get supplies to get through the winter. and she got caught shoplifting. And me being 19, I thought, it's just so stupid. When it came up, in the court, the magistrate's court, I thought that saying that I knew she was going to do this would somehow, it was like supportive to her. It's just a teenager, the logic is ridiculous. But of course, it meant that actually this was all planned. I didn't know that she was going to do this. She decided to. It was winter underwear, $10 winter underwear that she stole. And so they came down on me like a ton of bricks. And my name on the West Coast sort of made it into the newspapers. Charles Manson arrested. And this was about the same time that I think it was in the paper the same day that Jimi Hendrix's death was announced as well in London. And so they put me in jail for a bit and decided to deport me. The magistrate was really quite, and I had no proper representation. I was just lost, really. And so I was handcuffed and led to an airplane. They sat with me until Edmonton, I think, and then they just put me on the rest of the flight to London. So I arrived back in London abruptly with absolutely no money and a little bit disorientated. So it took me a while to get things sorted. I'd slept in Holland Park, under bushes, sort of thing. There's a park just near to Charing Cross Station. As you go down the hill, the arches there, and then Embankment Station, there's a park there. I used to sleep there as well. And then I'd have to, because I had no residence, I couldn't get money from the dole. So I'd have to go to the East End every day to pick up money. They would allow a certain daily allowance. It was mostly for sailors from the docks. The docks still kind of existed in those days. And there was a sort of welfare office there that I could go on a daily basis. And of course, you'd have to take the tube, which would then take some of your money. And then I'd come back. And this went on for a little while until I said, well, look, my parents are in Holland. If I could go if you could give me enough money to get on the boat to Holland, I would go back there and, try and get something sorted out. Why couldn't I get a job? I don't know. But I wasn't thinking straight, really. And so that they agreed, fortunately. They made a special grant, and it was £6 in those days. And I went on the boat back to Holland and turned up all of a sudden. My parents didn't, they still thought I was in the USA. And said, I'm back here and I need to do something. And so we discussed it, and I had seen in Vancouver Island, these totem pole carvers, and they were quite well known. And I was very attracted to this. I'd done a certain amount of carving of spoons on the beaches of Vancouver Island, and selling them and stuff very briefly that summer. And so I'd found out that there was an art college in Kennington in London, South London, that taught wood carving. So I asked, and my parents kindly agreed to send me there. It wasn't very expensive in those days, and I sort of lived on, I think my rent was £4 a week. I lived on about £10 a week or something, and started to study wood carving there. So it was quite a journey from intellectual happiness in Colombia to being a bit silly, well, worse than silly, illegal, or being associated with somebody who did something illegal, and then the state comes crashing down on you. But I kind of worked out a way of getting out of it, I suppose, and progressing in a different direction.
That must have been quite devastating.
Yeah.
Not to mention arriving in London, being unable to contact anybody, your parents who could help you,
Yeah.
and with no money, homeless.
Mm.
That's quite a change of circumstance from Colombia.
Yeah, it is.
Suddenly, abruptly, and roughly.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I managed it though. It's. I think you see. I have grandchildren now, and one of them's the eldest is 15, my boy, and it made me think. What did I get up to at 15? Well, sometimes in the holidays, I mean, my parents were in Holland. In the half-term holidays, I would just go off hitchhiking. In those days, it just sounds ridiculous now, perhaps, but in those days, you could just. I remember having a friend when I was at the art school. We were sharing a house, and this fellow said he was a musician. He said, "I want to go to Greece." He had £10. He set off for Greece, hitchhiking. And it sounds incredible now, but and he made it. And 2-3 weeks later, he came back. I don't know how he fed himself and stuff, but there was a kind of freewheeling atmosphere around. In some respects, in some respects there wasn't. Those things that happened in New York sometimes. There was, as we know now, there was both the good and the bad, as there usually is. Yeah. So it was quite, but I don't think. I suppose it did accentuate that slight searching thing. Yeah, I can definitely recall this feeling of there must be something. There must be something, and I kind of need to find it, which is a strange feeling, but I think that's so I got engaged on the practical level with the wood carving, which was something I felt I liked doing, I could do. I didn't really think about the commercial aspects of it, but I continued to follow on that sort of slightly spiritual searching thing. I used to go to the Druids meetings. There is actually a photograph of, I mean, I'm in a photograph of the Druids at Stonehenge. It just so happened that the Times was there that day, and they put it in page 3 or something. And I happened to be there. So I was kind of involved. I was a bit of a butterfly, going, just really looking, I suppose, the Druids, and then looking at Zen a bit more, getting involved in karate, and then sort of gradually gravitating towards Tibetan Buddhism.
You worked as a woodcarver for 15 years or so?
Yes, at least, yes.
And you were in Germany for a period of time also?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the wood carving, just too much of a butterfly, really. I did the course for a year or two, and then locally in Bermondsey, there was a firm, E.J. Bradford, it was called. They were sort of architectural decoration, and they would supply over the river to the city, because usually, that's where the money was for the grand buildings. They would supply plaques and bits of sculpture that goes on walls. In the city, they have, when you enter the city, there's those dragons, no, griffins, sorry. Griffins, sort of fierce animals, either as a coat of arms or just sort of sitting there on a post of some sort. We did those. That was the kind of things we did. That was in plastic, fiberglass. In what, some of them are metal, but we didn't do the metal so much. It was the days of fiberglass, and I did the wood side. But sorry, this firm, I used to work at Bermondsey Antiques as a student. Bermondsey Antiques Fair market. It was on a Friday. I used to help set it up. There are people who turn up at 3 o'clock in the morning to put up the posts and then the tables for these markets to run. And as a student, it meant a bit of money. So I would turn up, and then I got talking to somebody, and he said, I said, I was studying to be a woodcarver. And he said, oh, there's this firm down the road in Bermondsey that they're looking for a woodcarver. They've just got a contract with the Houses of Parliament. So I went round there, and I wasn't, really qualified enough, but perhaps I had some talent, I suppose. And I applied for the job, and I got it. They gave me a trial to start with, and they gave me the sort of easy jobs, and I got the job and stayed there for a couple of years. And at some point I decided to go to Germany, to Oberammergau in Bavaria, where they're famous for woodcarving. They're famous for the plays, the Christian plays that happen every 10 years there. And in between, they make money. The village, the town makes money by having a lot of woodcarvers there, and people buy the religious work. So I went there for a while. This was 74 by now. And if you remember, the oil crisis happened in 74, and there was a sort of consequent shrinking of economies, and being the first into this firm in Oberammergau, I was first out as well, and being a foreigner too. It wasn't, we were in Europe, but not, it was still quite different in a way. And so I came back, and besides, I had a girlfriend had written to me in Germany to say that I'd fathered a child with her, so I'd needed to come back for that anyway. Yes. Big change again.
That must have been quite a surprise.
Yes. Yes, it was. Yes. So, yeah, you have to come back and deal with that. And at the time, Ken Livingstone, of all people, was head of the GLC in those days. And they'd got a program where we had been, before I'd gone to Germany, we had been living in a squat, an empty shop. And they had a program for getting people out of the slum. This was in Bonington Square in Vauxhall, now quite yuppified. The program to get people out of London, and they would help them buy a house. It would be a small house, and it was sort of subsidized mortgage, basically. So it was £5,000 you had to apply. And so she did most of the work on that. She was good at applying. and the paperwork. She was a talented artist. So we yes, got a house for £5,000 in Essex, a wee cottage, and paid £30 a month, I think, as the mortgage, and that was subsidised by the GLC. And then Alistair was born, and I had no money. But yes, I managed to find I can't remember what I did for a while. Anyway, we kind of cobbled things together, but fairly soon there was a furniture company about 5 or 6 miles away, and they had wood carving. They did reproduction antique furniture, and so I managed to get a job. I used to have to cycle back, and I did that for a little while, and then I felt it was time to start on my own, so I set up on my own after that.
And what was the status of your search at that time?
Yeah, this is well, looking after a child takes up a lot of energy and time, and working for yourself is also very time consuming, as I'm sure you know. I would still go to by this time I'd found out a bit more about Tibetan Buddhism. Now, back as a student in London, sharing this house, I'd gone. There was an Indian, I think he was 16 or something, and he was supposed to be terrific. I can't even remember his name, but there were various people, and he came to London, and I went a couple of times, but I didn't feel any connection. And then I went to the Buddhist Society, where actually, when was this? 72, 71. So in 2023, what's that, 52 years later, I'm talking there next week about, guess what, Karma Pakshi for their anniversary day. And they're 99 years old. Not quite that much. So I'd been going to them as well for meditation instruction, Buddhist. I'd gone to the Buddhist place in Wimbledon too. So there was a sort of general, and this hadn't happened quite yet. No, and he said, "Oh, you're interested in this? Here's a book." As you did in those days, people probably still do. You might be interested in this, and it was Trungpa Rinpoche's Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and it was it had quite a, as it did on a lot of people, I think, quite a sort of direct effect. And I read it and said, "Oh, well, that's terrific. I've got a lot from that." And he said, "Well, he's up in Scotland." Would you believe this? Tibetan center. And so, in one of the Easter break from college in the woodcarving place, I decided to make a trip up there hitchhiking. Only I didn't go direct. I went through Wales and up through Ireland. It was a bit of a scenic trip. Ended up in Northern Ireland in slightly odd situations with, it was when, the Troubles were at their height, really. There, this wandering English boy turns up. But I think now I was really quite fortunate. There was one incident I was quite fortunate. I just kind of I think they saw that I was completely innocent of anything. This was not, I suspect that they were IRA people, but anyway, let's leave that. So I made it across Stranraer to Estelmuir and went to the Buddhist center. And of course, Trungpa Rinpoche had only just left the previous winter. I arrived in the Easter, and it was Akong Rinpoche there. And I was sort of fiddling about in the workshops there, doing a bit of carving, actually. And I'd brought my tools with me. And he immediately said, "Would you like to come and work here?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So I said, "But I'm going to college. I'm going to go back, and I'll come up in the summer." So I then went back to college, and eventually went to Germany. And I went back and forth to Samye Ling a number of times, and Akong Rinpoche started teaching, and I would go to those teachings that he would have in the winter or the summer. And so I'd kept that connection, and then I made a connection with Chimi Rinpoche, and he had a place in Ashton, in near Saffron Walden in Essex, and I would go there, and so there was that connection. And then the Karmapa came in 74. Alistair was born in late 74, and it was about the time that actually we went to see him when she was still pregnant with him. And so we went to Marpa House in Ashton, and then we also went up to Samye Ling as well. And the Karmapa at the time would be giving initiations in the Karma Pakshi practice. And I would, and he would very often, he would say to people, say, "What shall I do? What Buddhist practice shall I do?" People were generally quite ingenue about the whole thing. And he would say, "Do the Karma Pakshi practice." And that kind of struck me at the time. That was my sort of first introduction, shall we say. So there was, and then I started doing what are called the preliminary practices, which were quite difficult to do as a householder as well, doing the prostrations and so forth. So I did that. So I suppose I'd really made I had taken refuge by then. I had made a commitment to Tibetan Buddhism. I'd stopped searching, really.
At that time, you said that Samye Ling didn't have, when you initially were there, I think I said orbiting before, sort of being around,
yes,
working a bit.
Yeah.
Didn't have such a practice emphasis, more sort of communal living.
Yes.
Emphasis at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Although Sherab Palden was there, the famous artist.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what was the scene like, really, and did you connect at all with Sherab Palden? What do you think of him?
No, it was that's a source of regret, actually, on my part. I mean, I knew him, of course, and we would speak, and we went. He was on the same party that went on pilgrimage in 1980 with Akong Rinpoche, and I don't know, 20 or 30 people from Samye Ling. And he knew, what I did. I did the wood carving there and so forth, but he never asked me. Never. It was really. I don't know why. Just never did. He got a French woodcarver and he worked with him quite a lot. But for some reason, he never did with me. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know why. I just kind of waited and waited and waited, but it never happened. Yeah. It was quite a time. Sort of, let's say, where are we? 72 or 3, somewhere around there. The previous Kalu Rinpoche came, and I think I'm right in saying he was the first of the lamas to come direct from India, sort of high lamas. And we didn't know what, people didn't know how to greet him. We didn't really know what refuge was. We took refuge with him there because it was kind of recommended. But we really weren't, and he would give a certain amount of teaching and we would do, but well, this is just my impression. Other people may say quite different, but didn't really know. There was a sort of general bonhomie usually, but not really so much commitment. I think Akron Rinpoche then started giving people teaching, and sort of, I think Trungpa to a certain extent in a parallel way in the United States was sort of kind of tidying people up from their messy, quasi hippie-ish ways, I suppose, and getting them to think a bit more seriously about working with the mind.
I've heard you say that the charisma of the 16th Karmapa struck you. Great.
Yes.
I'm wondering about that. Actually, in terms of your involvement in Tibetan Buddhism, and this is where it really took root, was there anything in Tibetan Buddhism itself, say doctrinally, perhaps even aesthetically, that drew you? Or was it sort of confluence of this interesting Johnson House, Samye Ling project was happening and you sort of got involved with that, and there are some charismatic gurus that struck you, and and then doctrinal discovery came later? You've said that you didn't really know what was going on. Kalu Rinpoche came, you didn't know how to greet him, you weren't really how could you have known, of course, but of course over time you began to learn more and more and more about the religion and its various tenets and so on. So I suppose I've got two questions. What is it, do you think, that got you at the beginning? What was it that kept you interested in it at the beginning? Presumably it couldn't have been any understanding necessarily, because you didn't have it at that point. And then how did your understanding unfold? What was that journey like, from not really knowing what was going on to getting more and more understanding of what it was all about?
I think there was, you put it well, there was a sort of confluence of, but I think also reading books was quite important as well. For instance, taking refuge with Kalu Rinpoche in a sort of ignorant way, I would say of myself anyway, not really understanding what that was about. I then went back to a year or so later to Akron Rinpoche and said, can I take refuge again? Because I think I understand it a bit better now. And he said, yes, by all means, but you have to do a 3-day retreat as well, if you can. So I did that. And I remember, 3 days in retreat was just torture for, a mind that was very flitting about, I suppose. I found that very difficult. And now, 8 years is, it has its difficulties, excuse me. So, I remember in that time, I couldn't meditate particularly well. Not well at all. So I did read quite a lot of, for instance, Gampopa's, the translation of Gampopa's Jewel Ornament of Liberation by Gunther, which isn't all that easy. It's Gunther, easier read in some ways. But the way that the Buddhist teaching was worked out, I'd come across that in the Buddhist society, the more direct, just the Buddha teaching, rather than the tantric stuff that comes, the colorful, exotic tantra stuff as well. And that really appealed to me, and it seemed to work things out for my mind. That I felt, this really is thought out, is logical, and there's a certain amount of belief in reincarnation and so forth, and karma, I suppose, is a belief. But the ways about, oriented, it's not trying to get somewhere else necessarily, but more just dealing with what's inside better. And that orientation appealed to me. And then you've got somebody like, the Karmapa was just highly unusual. That's one way of putting it. And very inspirational too. So that was that combination of, the basic, that you could see, well, it seemed to me anyway, you could see some people that were swept along by that charisma, almost entirely, perhaps. And I don't know what's happened since for them. Maybe it's been excellent for them. But for me, there's a certain element of grounding in and perhaps too much, the intellectual, I don't know, side of things that, this made sense, that made sense as well. And then on top of it, you've got this attractive, slightly exotic Tibetan Buddhism culture, which I very much enjoyed.
You met several different lamas and high lamas at that period. What was it you think that set apart the 16th Karmapa in terms of his impact or his sort of radius of charisma?
It is charisma. What is charisma? It's difficult. It can be in a sort of secular way. There's an old friend from Samye Ling who used to work in the casinos in the 60s in London. And he said there was a couple of people that had it. One of them, he says, was Sammy Davis Jr. He'd walk into a room and whoosh, there's that effect, which is peculiar. How does that happen? Who was the other one? I think it was Frank Sinatra. Yeah. And possibly Sophia Loren. I can't remember now. But that, you hear stories of they must be quite ordinary in their homes, in their slippers, having breakfast. But somehow when they walk into I was quite fortunate to spend quite some time with the 16th Karmapa eventually in Sikkim, in Rumtek, his monastery there. Having breakfast with him, and he was still very special, even at breakfast. I don't know. It's a sort of power. I wouldn't analyze it terribly, but I wouldn't also go overboard about it. Get swept away too. I think it's I don't know. I just experience it. I think it's hard to put into words.
Charisma, I think, is, when I think of charisma anyway, I think it's there's something collaborative about it. You can't really be charismatic to yourself only, I presume. So there's always that question of some people seem to have something that's right, and other people, I think, one catches the charisma vicariously from others looking at them. This is celebrities, for example. I've noticed that
yes.
Occasionally, because someone is seen to be important and a big deal, they might even themselves shy away. It gives them a certain kind of shine or something, when everyone orients towards them. Suddenly that imparts something as well.
Yes.
Charisma, isn't it a gift of God or something like that? There's something divine about it too, isn't it? Implies some sort of spiritual. So certainly with this 16th Karmapa, highly revered. That's the collaborative part. But also, presumably, one acquires that kind of power, potency, through esoteric means.
Yes. Yes. People refer to it as blessing. There is something that happens, you know. It's like this hole in the top of your head. And yeah, there's that sort of energy that happens, either thinking about such a person or being in their presence. It starts with being in their presence, I suppose. And that's the spiritual side, I think. Yeah, it's I can't put it into words, but that can develop by working on the mind. And there are these practices that help in that way. They're quite repetitive, often. They're to do with imagination, certainly in the tantric practice. There's quite a lot of imagination. One has to become quite adept at that, I think. Which, you know, when we read books, we have imagination. You know, we imagine the whole scenario through the print. So that aspect of our mind, our brain, works to a certain extent. But in meditation practices to do with visualizations, I think that is enhanced. It's a sort of way of getting to a different place gradually. And it's not just that, though. One could say, oh, it's mental exercises. There's a blessing involved. And it seems to be, when they talk about transmission and lineage, and how so important they are. It's the be all and end all in some ways, because it does go back, apparently, to the Buddha himself. And there was an extraordinary being. And if some of that blessing can come to us, then that's what these practices are sort of about. There's an element of self-training the mind, but also making a connection to something that's incredibly, well, not incredibly, just is pure. And that is the very powerful thing. I would say that, yeah, there was that sort of the manifestation of it was this charismatic power, but as much as I can put it into words, think that it comes from purity, the purity of mind. Somebody who was, we all have pure minds, but somebody who was, had actually sort of realized his pure mind, I suppose. And that is very powerful.
What was the 16th Karmapa like at breakfast? And you said it can be taken a bit far. This sort of impact can blow people out a little and take it a bit far. I'm wondering what you had in mind when you said that too. So there's two questions.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that. Yeah, no, I stand by that. Breakfast. just so calm and gentle. Oh, occasionally issuing, you know, dealing with practical things, an order or request or something, but it was just, it's hard to put into words. Just very nice. But I wouldn't get soppy about it. You know, I was quite practical, would joke a little bit. Wasn't entirely just gaga about the whole. And I think that's maybe why, to a certain extent, you know, I was able to be present. It was a slightly unusual time. This is 1980, 81, I think, early 81. And Sharma Rinpoche was there, Situ Rinpoche, Jamgon Control, the one who's, well, Sharma and Jamgon Control is dead now, and Gyaltsab. They were all there at the time. So I was quite fortunate. Yeah, I'm sorry, I got a bit lost thinking about it.
Let's go back 1 year from there.
Yes.
1980, you said that there was a pilgrimage from Samye Ling that
Mm,
you went on, but you went
mm.
on that pilgrimage with something of a heavy intention.
Yes. 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 It's well, Maggie, Alistair's mother, we were living. So, well, there was trouble, but anyway, she developed cancer, and it was very awkward, very difficult. Breast cancer. She, well, we were treated quite. Things were quite difficult then. There was only one in the whole of London at that time, in the whole hospital system. There was only one cancer. What would they call it? Consultant, not consultant, not a medical sense, but advisor. Somebody you could go and speak to. And of course, there were, things had changed then, and it was very, you do what the doctor tells you or not. And she was, unfortunately, she didn't. Rather, she sort of went looking for alternative things. And anyway, it's a sad story. It took, they said at the time, it'll take 3 or 4 years, and if you don't do anything. And you did more of the alternative things, and they didn't work. But in 1979, when the pilgrimage started, when was it? 1980. 1980. She was kind of. It was the beginning of the end. There was a sort of denial going on, and I don't know. Maybe it was a mistake on my part, but I thought that I would accept, the families, and it all became very difficult. I accepted that she was going to die. And I thought that if I could go to these holy sites and pray on her behalf, may sound a bit silly, but it may have some good influence for her. Just in the sense, I didn't have the idea that it was going to cure her in any way. But it was, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was part of my, I wouldn't use the word trauma, but, difficulty in relating to the whole thing. Young person, I was rather on my own in a way. The families were there, but there was a certain amount of conflict going on, and anxiety as well, and anxiety about the child. So I did decide to go. It was supposed to be for a few weeks, a couple of months, was it? I can't remember now. And she went to live with her sister for a bit, and I made it back. She was still alive, but yeah, maybe it wasn't a good episode on my part. But that's what I felt at the time.
What was the conflict that was going on?
Oh, it's sort of, there was, sister. Well, you can see she didn't want to have operations, and they were insisting, the family would be insisting. There would be all these phone calls, and I would try and talk to her for ages about it. Trying to be some kind of cancer advisor in a way. which I had no experience of. I was just a very ordinary person. And so I would get her into a, well, not get her, but we would come to some almost resolution about, well, yes, maybe we should, maybe we should have the operation. And then she would speak on the phone with the family, and then it would all kind of blow up, and you'd sort of be back to square one. And no, I'm not going to do it. And it was just difficult. That's just my take on it. Other members of the families maybe see it quite differently. But I didn't. Perhaps I didn't deal with it very well. In fact, I fully admit that I didn't. My only mitigation was that I was young and somewhat didn't have much support. I didn't feel I had much support anyway. I was trying to deal with this.
How old were you at that time?
I was 29. Yeah, 29, which I suppose is old enough to deal with that kind of thing. But the hospital experience was usually not good. I mean, it didn't help that she was kind of got their backs up to a certain extent. And once you start getting the medical professions backs up, I think that, everybody, the medics, the patients, everybody's moved on quite a lot from that. They learnt quite a lot. It's really quite different. Macmillan and all of that wonderful, wonderful stuff that they do. Our understanding how to deal with it. It was just unfortunate, well, more than unfortunate, tragic really, that it wasn't dealt with better. And I don't feel myself blame anywhere. And that's not a very deliberate intention not to feel. The only person that, perhaps I think could have acted better is myself on this. And I'm not doing that as a sort of deliberate sympathy invoking mea culpa. It's just true. And there's not much I can do about it. So kind of have to live with that.
Because you went to India, is that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that was necessarily a mistake, but it wasn't necessarily the wisest thing to do. Oh, I'm quibbling, really. Yeah, it's yeah. But what you see, you knew she was going to die, and there was just some kind of hope. Yeah, it was a desperate last throw of the dice, but something like that. It was my way of coping, I suppose, was to perhaps invoke some kind of blessing, but it bred a bad reaction, you see, which wasn't sensible on my part, and I should have just changed my mind about it, but I didn't. So that was a mistake in that sense. Yeah, not being flexible enough.
Maggie died in May of 1980.
Yes.
And what happened next? What happened to you? What happened to Alistair?
Yeah. Well, it goes into sort of family tugs. And yeah, while on the pilgrimage, I had asked about becoming a monk, and well, I hadn't actually asked. I'd asked about taking some vows and then been recommended to become a monk. And so that's kind of how it happened. So I did, and so I came back as a monk, and then she died about a month or so later. And then there's a tug, but you have two, my mother and Maggie's, excuse me, sister. Two strong females, very maternal, and that's my interpretation anyway. And what to do with the child? And so I was actually, I got messy, sort of solicitors. And so I won't go into all of that, but the kind of upshot, in my terms anyway, was that I couldn't really take them to court about this. I didn't feel that was a good thing to do. We'll get even messier. And I felt that if he was with me, it would be a slightly strange experience. And he was missing his mother. And that a female influence was extremely important. And so it then became almost an argument between, should he go with the sister or should he go with my mother? And I made the case that it should be with the mother. They both wanted to look after him. They didn't think that it was suitable to be with a monk in a monastic environment. Well, it's Samye Ling. Samye Ling wasn't so monastic in those days. And so he stayed with my mother. They had a large-ish house, and she kindly looked after him for this period. And I would go and see him quite a bit. And I suppose, I don't know, it's you could see all of this as being my unspoken way of dealing with this kind of tragedy, trauma. It's like almost like a running away in a way. It could be seen that way anyway. I didn't feel necessarily that way, but and then a few years later, Samye Ling was going through a very good period at this time of having lots of very excellent teachers coming: Trungpa Rinpoche, Sit Rinpoche, Gyaltsen Rinpoche, Sharma Rinpoche, and giving extensive teachings and so forth. So that was very good. And Alistair would come in the summer holidays and stay with me. But then the idea of doing retreat came up, and again, maybe, I don't know, I just felt that I should. He had got settled in, 3 or 4 years later into this, and there was a kind of dichotomy going on, these different environments, and I thought maybe it was just better if he had the environment that he was in there, and that I pursue my path. Again, perhaps selfish, I don't know, or perhaps coping. Hard to make a judgment, really. Well, hard for me anyway, but I'm aware of those ways of interpreting it. And so I decided to join the first group. It was quite a small group, 6 or 7 people, to do this lengthy retreat.
So that was the first.
Yeah.
Ended up, 3-year retreat, but then it was actually 4 years.
Yes, 4 years.
How it was organized. In the UK, not in Europe. I think the first was in France, perhaps.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Yes. And
there was some preparation involved in that, among which was, I don't know if this was directly in preparation, 6 months in France with Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso learning Tibetan. That must have happened before, surely.
Yes, it did. Actually, Maggie was there. This was this was 77, something like that. This was after the Karmapa's second visit to Europe. Yeah, and no, that was quite a separate thing. There was this course in Europe and in France, La Poujade, near Kalu Ring. That was sort of starting up at the time, mid 70s, and the with Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, and that was excellent as well. Yeah, it was a good experience, but that's quite different. Yeah, the preparation for the retreat. Yeah, I think they made it 6 months. They said 6 months. The idea was that you would have to learn to read Tibetan, and if possible, speak it as well, because the Lama, his English wasn't good, and you would learn what was going to be done as well. It was all very new. So we did a certain amount of preparation for it, to learn to, I think I was reading Tibetan already by then, but for some people they hadn't, because everything was going to be done in Tibetan, the rituals and prayers and so forth. And he would instruct in Tibetan. Eventually we did get a translator. It was just too difficult for some people. Well, it was difficult for me as well. But that's how it started off, yeah. And I can remember going around the building before the start and thinking, oh, this is going to be wonderful. Meditation all day long. And in fact, there's a terrific amount of ritual involved. And it wasn't sort of, you're isolated, but just sharing the meals and the building together. To a certain extent, what the interactions between the people was extremely important. You learnt as much outside the room as you did inside the room, I think. Yeah. And I think generally people have recognized that in a group retreat, you can get high, shall we say, on meditation, very peaceful and so forth, and then you've got to deal with somebody else, or interact with somebody else who maybe isn't having such a good time, or finds you objectionable, or there's some kind of conflict, or maybe you have a bad time. You come out and in the breaks and cause other people problems. Yeah. It's a group situation, and the group part of it is extremely important. The learning that you go through in the group as well, highly valuable.
Yeah, I wonder if you might say something about more about that. I'm thinking about Karma Pakshi as you were talking there. His retreats, which you write about, he had a period of time of retreat before his monastery building or rebuilding activities.
Yes.
It seems it was mostly sort of solitary, in the sense that it was his retreat and he may have been in different places and supported by people, and he wasn't sort of totally isolated, but it was more or less his, for want of a better word, solo retreat.
Yes.
Context, yeah. And then I'm thinking of your situation there, a group retreat kind of curriculum one goes through. As far as I understand, you go through a certain kind of curriculum, and Kalu Rinpoche extended that curriculum in certain ways, which is why it took 9 months more than the usual 3 months, 3 years, 3 days, 3 minutes, 3 seconds, whatever it is, 3 breaths. And so I'm wondering about that, what you think of that group format versus sort of solo format, and to what extent that kind of group dynamic, well, you said it was a help, an important part of it, actually. I wonder if it might also be sort of as a hindrance. The reason I ask is there are also lots of these 3-year retreats that were going on around that time in Canada. And I've spoken to some people from there. and seems to be pretty 50-50 on whether they thought it was beneficial or kind of a waste of time slash actively detrimental
Mm.
to them. Some
Mm.
people, I think, felt that, well, some people have said to me they felt that way. This sort of 3-year retreat, they went into it, came out the other side, kind of regretted having doing it.
Oh,
Uh,
gosh.
I've heard
Wow.
that. I've
Oh,
heard that one person said to me, it's about 50-50, those that benefited to some degree, and
yeah.
might have been how it was going on there, but yeah.
Yeah.
Part of what they I remember the complaints were,
Hmm.
uh, this might be an odd way of me asking this question, but
No, go on.
part of what the complaints were was, well, our guiding lama was rarely there and didn't take much. There was a sense, I've heard the complaint, there wasn't much personal interest taken in my practice. Sort of we were all kind of funneled from group activity to group activity.
Mm. Mm.
Our guiding lama was always away doing other things, and that sort of thing. And the people I was with, it was very abrasive and difficult, etc., etc.
Mm.
So I think there's So anyway, of course, other people I know have had wonderful experiences in those early American and European. I suppose if you count North American and European 3 years.
Hmm.
So anyway, what can you make of all that I've just said?
Yeah. I'm slightly surprised also that you'd put it so high as well, but I don't know. I don't think, I mean, it was very, very difficult. There's you wouldn't really want it to be easy, I suppose. You're dealing with your internal shit, it's and it's quite raw, and you're, to a certain extent, you're dealing with other people's as well. I mean, you can never entirely deal with somebody else's. And I can see a little bit the feeling of you're left on your own a bit. And there was in the second retreat, there was a point where I felt that, and I have to be careful here because I don't want to make it seem like, it's some kind of self-justification or anything. But there was a point where you get about halfway through, and some of the instructions of the visualizations just weren't there, or they were, if you looked for them in Tibetan, but it hadn't been well explained. And I would say that was perhaps a bit of a fault, if you like. And it seemed, just this is my interpretation, that this was building up to quite a lot of frustration, not necessarily expressed directly, but people didn't really, some of the people anyway, the second time, the people in the second retreat, not the second timers, but the new people in the second retreat, they weren't getting the same instruction from the Lama that we had the first time people. And so what I did, and it may have been for myself a bit of a mistake because it involved getting involved in all of this, but rather than just focusing on the practice, but I translated some of the instructions, the visualization material, as much what I thought was important, and got it printed out. Had to send it away to get printed out and so forth. And it seemed like as soon as that happened the first time, it was Chakrasamvara practice, it kind of dissipated all of that energy that was going on. Now, anybody who was there may find that incredible, but you know, they may see it as a different story. But that's just what my feeling was, that there was a certain amount of there wasn't perhaps, and this may just be partly us Westerners mollycoddled and so forth, that we were to a certain extent left to work things out. And I would say that the valuable part of being left to work things out is the emotional side and your own hang-ups and what you discover within and all that. But the actual instruction, you know, you imagine the lights going here and there and all of that, that really needed more, something better to be. It probably is worked out now. You know, there's been an accretion of instructions printed and so forth. But so that people can actually read it and then apply it. But yeah, I can see that maybe a slight disgruntlement there about that. But the other side of the actual just working with emotions, I wouldn't begrudge that, although it was extremely difficult at times. Yeah. I did have somebody threaten to kill me at one point, which you wouldn't imagine in a retreat. But I don't know how seriously he meant it. But he was having a hard time. Yeah. And you just have to deal with it. It's okay now. I met him later. It's fine. And I'm still here. So, yeah.
So I'm curious, having never done a group retreat like that.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's all sorts of ritual, and then there's that you do as a group, and then presumably you go to your rooms and you have a certain amount of things that you're doing in the time when you're by yourself.
Yes.
But there's some other factors too. You're isolated from your usual routine and comforts and connections. You're in this place with other people, and you know, two doors down doesn't rinse the sink out when he brushes his teeth, that sort of thing. And why does the personal shit, as you put it, come up? Is something in the practices themselves that brings them up? Other practices introspective in the sense of you're sitting there thinking about your shit in particular? I mean, if you're visualizing lights coming out from, you know, doing all this sort of visualizations, how does that work on the inside in terms of one's issues? I'm curious as to how that comes up. Is it the being locked in a room, locked in a house with people, or is it the practice themselves, or is it the isolation? Is it the food? How does that?
Yeah. Well, it's not people's normal life, is it? We usually, you know, oh, I'm a bit bored, I'll go and do something. I'd like to eat this. All of those kind of distractions, and that gets narrowed down quite a lot. And you sort of have, you know, that initial 3-day retreat I did was just like at the age of, I don't know, what was it, 21 or something. That was torture, I found. I mean, I would complain about that one. And that was on my own, you know. But no, once you go into this group thing, I mean, there's some wonderful when people are working together, teamwork. You know, I really like teamwork, and when it goes well, of course. I don't know, why should it? Well, you are dealing with you are trying to change yourself in a way. Yeah, you are. And the commitment is, changing for the sake of all. But and you are looking at yourself. I don't mean, you're thinking, but this does happen, of course, but it's not deliberate. That's not sort of meant to be part of it. You're meant to be focusing on these pure deities and the meditations. And it's the mind. You're dealing with a mind, difficult, as we all know. I think it seems very obvious now to me, but as I say, I went and looked, at the empty building before we started, and thought, oh, it's going to be so peaceful, and filming it largely on my own, and just there was a kind of running away, I suppose. Yeah, but it was actually quite confrontational in some ways, but not all the time. I would hasten to add, yeah, it wasn't misery all the time. People would go up, people would go down, people would deal with it, and then suddenly, they'd work it out. It was, I can't say, I mean, my mother did ask me at one point, sort of, we were in the kitchen, and it was a year or two afterwards, she said, what do you think about it now? And I said, well, it's the best thing I've ever done, and I don't mean that in the way of achieving anything, but just it was the most worthwhile thing, I suppose, is the best way to put it. Yeah.
What did you face in there? I've heard you talk about having almost sort of tulku heart attacks.
Oh gosh,
things like that, and and you certainly had a lot of pain in your history up to this point. We've discussed it. You've had a lot of pain at that point, so you're going into all that deep inside. So, what did you face in there?
Well, there was that physical side, which was really quite worrying at the time. But the Lama, he was there at the time, Lama Ganga, and he just, I think he said, "Oh, he gave me the impression that that was just to be expected. It was the nadis kind of getting straightened out." But I really thought I was going to die. It was like that, this is a tremendous sort of heart attack going across your chest rather than up and down the arms or anything. And I suppose there's a medical, something was going on in the chest area. And and also I think where was it? This is the first year. My father had an actual heart attack. There's a history of it on the male side in my family. And you sort of get one letter a month. He's had a heart attack and everything. That was quite worrying. So you sort of have to sit with that and deal with that as well. The whole thing of, how my child was doing, that was not easy in a way. But these are kind of just really personal things. I don't think and also there was quite a strong antagonism, shall we say, from another person, and maybe I didn't deal with it very well, but I think that was sometimes quite difficult. I would cause other people difficulties. I know that, as well. So, I wouldn't. I think you just come out stronger. Stronger. I hope, anyway. I feel stronger in a way.
I'm curious which practices you were doing at the time of your tulku heart attacks.
Oh, it was tulku. Yeah, yeah. It was during that period, and you're beginning to deal with the inner nadis, the knots as they call them, and some of them it's expressed as being kind of old, and of course they're not really physical, but the and yeah, a distinct feeling of knots, yes, being straightened, shall we say, and then the air's moving more freely. It's quite a, yeah, I can't imagine anybody saying that that wasn't beneficial practice, the tulku. I don't know. Maybe for some, the pain was too much. I don't know, or the difficulty. But I found that extremely helpful. And it helped the mind too.
You did two
Yes.
back to back.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two more questions about the retreat. First of all, as far as I understand, and I'm thinking now in particular of people I've talked to finished this same sort of retreat in France and in Canada. I think Canada was under Kalu Rinpoche's umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Completion of that retreat in the Kagyu tradition technically qualifies you to be a lama. Is that correct? That is correct, isn't it?
Oh dear. Yeah. But it's not. Yeah. I don't feel like I'm a lama. Okay. I do feel like I've got a university degree. Okay. But I don't feel like I'm a lama. No.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's, yeah. I mean, you get called a lama if you're just a monk, often in culturally. If you go to Nepal or Tibet, they go, lama, lama, like that. So there's that kind of level where it's just, somebody who's in robes, really. And the sort of common level. And then you might say was sort of middle is that they developed the Tibetans, the monastic system. There were retreatants, and then they kind of codified it into this 3-year like graduation type of practice. And so as a result of that, you then had a certain degree, however, the retreat affected you, you had a certain amount of knowledge and experience. And so you got called a lama. You're distinguished in that way because you have done retreat. But then you would take, I think, a more elevated thing, that somebody who really has some degree of realization. And that would be the sort of grade 3 lama, if you like, if you wish to grade these things. So, I qualify as the middle type, but nobody would suggest, that it went any further than that. It's just something you've done, but it doesn't necessarily speak to your qualities. Whereas proper lamas, so to speak, I don't mean that to mean that they're improper, be derogatory, but the top level, it's more, it's really speaking to their qualities rather than just something they've done.
How universal is that view? The reason I ask that is because I have spoken to people on this podcast who have taken their completion of a 3 retreat, it seems, as a sort of, and they report seems to have been encouraged to do so, to take it as a kind of
fine. I don't
staff to go out and teach and lead and start organizations and so on. People have done that, right?
Yeah, sure. And well, they may well be, if they've been asked to do that, then they are qualified. It's sort of, I mean, anybody could set them. There probably are, I don't know, people who haven't done much at all decide to become nuns. But it's not, I don't decry it at all. It's not, you know, if they are teaching, I think that that's something that's quite important. That maybe, you know, when you get made a monk or you become a monk, you get called venerable. Yeah, that's this kind of acceptable term that and also in Christianity, it's reverend and all that. Well, are you really revered necessarily? You know, you might be just a very ordinary run-of-the-mill priest, but you are called reverend. And so I think that, venerable, yeah. It's useful because it perhaps gives people a little bit of a respect. Yeah. I don't, you know, you call somebody Mr., Mrs., Miss, Ms. It's just a matter of affording them respect for what they're doing. And if they're teaching, then they really should be called a lama, I suppose. And maybe that's another, you know, slightly elevated beyond the person who, you know, just does a retreat. Okay, that qualifies you as a lama just as a name. But then, yeah, maybe I should have introduced a intermediary in my schema, that a teacher who's teaching people Buddhism, then they should, yeah, why not call them a lama? Yeah, it's perfectly valid, I think. Yeah. And then you got somebody who's been sort of appointed a lama, agreed by, you know, high lamas that they should be called a lama, and they are called that because of their inherent qualities of realization.
No, I would like to ask you if you feel you achieved any realization from that, but I'm not sure if one's allowed to really. I mean, I'm allowed to ask whatever I like, but I don't suppose I get an answer out of you.
Yeah. Well, you know, a certain degree, should we say. It wasn't. I think you've got the picture that it's by no means a waste of time. But I wouldn't, you know, I just do what I do, you know. It's and sometimes people don't like it, and sometimes I don't like it. But I think Lama Ganga had a quite interesting thing. He said that after a retreat, you will have all sorts of ideas of what you're going to maybe do or not do. You know, some people are quite ambitious or not, or whatever it is. But after a few years, you'll find that you are where you want to be. You know, that's what you want. You know, it's a self-fulfilling thing. And I kind of found myself, well, there was a certain amount of, you know, after retreat, unusual circumstance with a terma finder, but that sort of went, well, not nowhere, but it didn't develop into anything much. Could have done perhaps. And I ended up, you know, working in libraries and stuff, still associated with Buddhism and Tibetan Dharma, Buddhist Dharma, and just trying to, well, not trying, but yeah, I suppose trying, be helpful in making information available and preserving it for people as well.
That spirit of service. That's well, yes. You've said as much, although perhaps not as immodestly as I'm saying it. But
yes,
you're talking about a spirit of service. It seems that you've oriented towards subsequently. That's yeah. When you come out of 8 years of retreat, I'd imagine one would be kind of institutionalized, like coming out of prison, but like enlightenment prison or something. So that must have been interesting. I'm wondering what that was like, reintegrating into life again. And also, Yeah, well, we can start there, but then I would like to ask you about your remarkable encounter with Karma Rinpoche, and
Mm,
the Chulen retreat that you carried out
mm,
subsequently,
mm.
and so on. So there's quite a lot of interesting things that happen next. So what about the
Yeah.
institutionalization? How did you reintegrate?
Yeah. Well, yet again, you finish something kind of happens and you've got no money and what to do. The I took a bit of time, I suppose, just to um, see family and things. And then when was it? Came out in February, I think, the New Year, Tibetan New Year, Lunar New Year. And sort of in the summer, um, there was a certain amount of, meeting up with family again to reintegrate in a way. And then in the summer, the retreat ended at the New Year, the Lunar New Year in the February. And in the summer, Lama Yeshe at Samye Ling, he had met this Karma Rinpoche at the time of the inauguration of the 17th Karmapa in Tsopo. And they apparently had got on very well. And this Karma Rinpoche, who's had a reputation as a tertan, he'd had discovered 30 termas, apparently. He had come out of Tibet. He'd had a short-term visa to leave, to go to India, and then he had to return. And he had written to Lama Yeshe to ask him if he could come to receive instruction on the Chulen practice for a terma of his. He was something of an expert on Chulen. He's got a terma on this. And Lama Yeshe thought that he was too busy, or he didn't want to go, or whatever it was. And so he asked me and one of the nuns who had been in the retreat at Tsering to go and receive the instruction. So we got some sponsorship to go and went to India and met him, Karma Rinpoche, and he gave some instruction in retreat in the caves above Lake Rawalsa, Tsopema, Tibetans know it as, where Guru Rinpoche had spent time with Mandarava back in the day. And he was sort of holding a retreat there. And it was quite, it's quite exciting time. And anyway, so we received instruction in the various chulens, in the sort of herbal chulen and the stone chulen. There's then a water chulen and an air chulen as well. And the chulen means extracting the essence, and it's a way of doing a practice where you eat very little indeed. You do your practice and you sort of get sustenance through extracting the essence. That's what it means. And so for the herbal one, you take a pill, one pill a day. And then for the stone, you actually do chew little bits of stone, grit, I suppose you would call it. And water, you just survive on water. And then air, chulen, is just you survive on air. So quite difficult, but very useful if you're a yogi in the high mountains. So anyway, we were doing this, and then he decided, he had a dream or a vision, that, well, no, he had an inspiration, shall we say, that there was a terma inside a particular rock. He'd been doing a sort of evening walk around, and this rock was, you can't see the, let's say, half a meter, a couple of feet, maybe the most. It was like almost a boulder, really, quite big. But there was one and a sort of lozenge shape. There was one Tibetan there who's, quite large, and he got him to lift this rock and bring it into the cave, and he decided to do a week's air retreat with this rock, because he was convinced that there was a terma inside it. So they sealed up the cave, and he spent time in there, and there was actually an air hole that went up, so I could hear him sometimes, chant. He was very given to singing spontaneous gur songs in the Tibetan manner, in the yogi manner. And so he spent a week doing it, and then they opened the cave, and he was very happy, should we say, that there was a terma. So he told us afterwards, excuse me, I'm just going to cough a second. He told us afterwards that there had been a point, 4 or 5 days, 5 days into it, that he got quite despairing, and that nothing was happening, so to speak. He tied a special string round the boulder, should we call it, the rock. And then he'd had a vision that a female deity had told him to carry on, that don't, despair. And then the next day or afterwards, at some point, the rock just cracked open. And inside, there was like not, half and half, but like a sort of lid type part of it. And inside, there was a sort of about that size, maybe, excavation of shapes. And there were shapes put into it, like a bit like in a child's toy, you have something that you push through a circular shape or a triangular shape. Well, there was a triangle, there was a circle, there was a square, there was a triangle, and then there was a semicircle. There was a semicircle and a triangle, in that order. And they were all slightly colored, the white, the yellow, the red, and the dark. And then on top of that was laid a certain amount of text, very short text. All of this inside this rock. Now, okay, I had, listened to a certain extent or been around the area, and you didn't hear the chip, chip, chip of somebody with a chisel chopping out something. I knew something about carving. I'd been around stone carvers. So it did seem quite unusual, and he was delighted, this was a terma. Wrapped the text up, and before people, because according to the tradition, that a terma can disappear as well. So the circumstances have to be quite carefully looked after. So we went into the cave, and he's sitting on one of these fold-up metal mattresses that you get in India, because the ground was kind of rough and a little bit damp as well, actually. And he's sitting there, and he's telling us about this, and he's singing a song. There's maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, 8 people there. And then he says, I feel a footprint. I must make a footprint. And he looks down at the ground, and it's all kind of, I think they call it schist. It's just, rubble, really. And then his nephew points out, oh, look, there's the wall there of the cave. So he leans over on this bed and puts his foot into the rock and leaves a footprint. And I looked at it afterwards very closely, and it was like, if you had very wet sand or even clay, I suppose, and you put your your hand or your foot into it, and it would even get the whorls of the skin, the fingerprint, I suppose, of from the toe, imprinted there, and that was what it was like. But this was rock, and it went in about a centimeter or so. So again, he was delighted with this because he'd made a footprint on his left foot in Tibet, and now he'd done in his right foot in India. And so, yeah, I met up with him, went with him traveling a bit in India. I think we went to see Siddha Rinpoche and went around a bit. And he was quite a character. He would burst out, you'd be in a restaurant having a song and he'd suddenly burst out into some song. The voice wasn't great, but it was very, it was quite powerful, really. Anyway, eventually I went back. He had to go himself. He had to go back to Tibet, and I went back to the UK. And the next year, I went to find him in East Tibet to ask about this terma, the text, that he interpreted it. Because it seems that, it was very few pages, but it needed the tertun, the finder of this terma, this treasure, to interpret it. And I went back the next year, and he said, "Oh no," it was such a journey. It was like, it was actually, yeah, I got not exactly arrested, but told to leave by the Chinese because I wasn't obeying the rules really, in a restricted area. And and when I eventually got there, he said, "Oh no, it's not ready yet." I had to come back. I went back the next year in the summer, and yeah, he gave me the text. I've now got a copy. Put it in the British Library. But this is expanded, so it's like 300 folios or so. Yeah, it's about Dzogchen. Excuse me. Yeah, so I kind of worked on it for a bit, but I didn't pursue it in the end, and I sort of lost touch with him. The second time that I went there, yes, that's right. We went up in the mountains. I met him near Jakundu, Yushu, and went up in the mountains to where he had been, Techen Karma. He had been one of these, there'd been a few of them, that when the communists came into Tibet, they, rather than run away or get killed or imprisoned, they'd just gone up into the hills as yogis and hidden out there, and to a certain extent had been looked after by the local population, secretly bringing them food and that sort of thing. And there was a couple of them, and he knew of another one who lived up in the hills, and so went up there, and it turned out that they were doing this yeshibab practice, the people there, and I made some, this was the second time I went back, I made some film there, which I haven't done much with really, I ought to. And there's where people sort of go into trance, I suppose, would be the best way to express it. And they use this as a practice in a way. And it helps them. My interpretation is that it seems to help them with their practice through, it's doing something with their nadis, I'm not sure. But there were some people who it was extremely painful. And one presumes that their nadis were in a particular bad form somehow. There was one poor woman, it kept on happening to her, and she would persist because it was her practice, but it would cause her a lot of pain. There were others who would kind of dance around. It would be quite a joyful thing. I did film somebody who sort of became a Mahakala, and he would just prance around as a Mahakala, as we're told would do, making these extraordinary sounds. It was quite frightening to a certain extent. There was a woman who they quite revered, a young woman, who would just go into he had a lovely voice, she had a lovely voice, long songs as well, just singing out across the mountains. And that was what it inspired her to. That was part of her trance practice, I suppose. Myself, I never experienced the trance, so I didn't really try, but yeah, it didn't happen to me. So that was just part of that that second trip, and I brought the Tama here, and I had the Chulen practice as well. And I told people about it, but nobody seemed particularly interested, so I left it, really. Unfortunately, perhaps, I don't know, but it's around. I think yeah, somebody did look at the Chulen a bit. They were studying it, but yeah.
No one was interested in the Chulen? That seems surprising to me.
Yeah. Well, I'm not experienced, I don't have a certain degree of transmission, I suppose. But yeah, no, it's not. It doesn't seem to. It's quite difficult, fasting.
Yes.
Yeah.
You did a retreat at that time. You had a cottage in Scotland you were living in, as far as I understand, and when you came back, you did some retreat there with the Rilbu and the Do Chulen.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm wondering how did that go?
Quite well, I think. Yeah, quite well. It was a little bit difficult, as I say, the fasting and all that. It's not. You do eat every now and again, but yeah, that was quite. It was okay, yeah, but it didn't. I didn't find it terribly attractive in a way. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it didn't grab me. Is another way of putting it, I suppose. So I kind of left it as well. I did a dark retreat there as well, which I found very useful too, where you, in a completely dark room, you have to organize the ventilation so that no light gets in. Have a curved ventilation tube, black out everything, and then have a system for food coming in, that you have sort of triple doors that you can put it, close, and then you can go in and get it without any light coming in. And also your waste as well can go out in plastic bag or bottle. And that's sort of linked to the Bardo, what's called a Bardo retreat. Yeah, got that instruction from Ajahn Tulku. Did one in Nepal, a short one, and then did a longer one in Scotland. That was very useful, and I wouldn't mind doing that again sometime.
2 weeks in Nepal, wasn't it? And how long in Scotland?
I think it was a week in Nepal and 3 weeks in Scotland. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes they say 7, but I thought I did. Yeah, the sort of general idea about it is that what people say is that at 2 weeks is when it gets really difficult. You can go a little. Some people break the retreat, and it seems to be at around about 2 weeks, and they not exactly crazy, but there's something goes wrong, so to speak. So it's a difficult time. And actually, yeah, when I did the 3-week one, lo and behold, round about 2 weeks in, you get a very sort of tempestuous time mentally just going on in your head, really, not health-wise, not just completely sort of visionary-wise, perhaps, as well. Yeah, it does induce a certain degree of visions too. But once you get through that, it's fine, you know, so it seems to be anyway. It's like a tempestuous time. And that does seem to happen. I only say that, you know, it's not written down in that way, but I've heard it a couple of times. It may well not be true in every case, but I certainly found that.
Gosh. Well, we're closing in on the present day.
Yes. Yes.
We're closing in. From what I understand, you worked as a subtitler for 10 years for TV, BBC, and so on.
Yeah.
And then eventually returned after, well, a rather long gap from Columbia to in terms of academia. You returned back to academia.
Yes. Yes.
And did your BA at SOAS and rediscovered perhaps, your passion for that academic life.
Yeah.
And were advised to apply to Harvard, and you did. And you did your master's in theological studies at Harvard Divinity School.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a return to form.
Yeah, there'd always been regret about the academia, you know, thing, I suppose. And yeah, so, well, I was in Scotland, you know, doing occasional retreats and stuff, and basically doing the woodcarving. I've gone back to the woodcarving a bit, in terms of supporting myself. And then this job came up, you know, in a newspaper. This is pre-internet days, 95. And it was for doing this captioning, subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing. And for some reason, I thought, oh, well, I'll do that. And I applied and got chosen. There was about 4 of us, I think. There's already a team there, but they were expanding quite a lot. And so I commuted between. They had slightly unusual work arrangements, and did that. Yeah, it ended up, well, I did a few years there. As soon as I got there, I realized, oh, this can be done from home. So I waited, you know, I did the commuting for 2 years, and then applied, asked them if, you know, it could be done from home. They said, no, of course it can't. And so I sort of did some research and persuaded them that it could be done from home, and maybe they should do an experiment with a few people. And they did, and it seemed to work. And I did about 5 years of, you know, the video cassettes. It wasn't streaming, and there was being sent up to Scotland, and you sending the file back, and then it gets broadcast. So that was quite well paid as well. So that was quite nice, living in Scotland and getting well paid as well, and quite interesting work too. There was a certain sort of repetitious element to it, but it was good working with words, really. And people say, oh, well, how come you went from woodcarving to working with words? Well, it was editing, you see. You have to get people speak faster than you can read. And so they had I think it was 650 characters per minute, was it? That was the standard. Children was slower, 550 or something. I think it started at 700 or 720, and then they went down to 650. And so you had to lose quite a bit. You had to edit and yet keep the drama or the humor or the feeling that was in the piece, whatever it was. Did a lot of Jerry Springer, would you believe? And every now and again, Charles Manson would get mentioned. And then at the end of the program, your name comes out. This was captioned by Charles Manson. So I wonder what deaf people thought of that. But anyway, yeah, so it was editing down, which is kind of what wood carving is. It's editing down a block of wood into a shape of some sort.
It sounds like a good training also at Sensum, sort of training in for translating.
Yes. Working with words. Yeah, it was very much. Yeah. But it sort of it came to a sort of natural, well, not a natural end, but I thought I was intellectually engaged in a way, and I thought I'd go back and study more. So I did it for a year, sort of part-time with the work, and then they had they needed to have some redundancies, so I applied, and you get quite a nice bit of money from a voluntary redundancy, and so I was able to do the degree from that in Tibetan studies, and then went to Harvard, and then came back and went to Oxford for a bit. I found that very expensive, and I got into debt a bit, and I didn't like that at all. So, but there were jobs came up, a couple of jobs. The Oxford Dictionary wanted somebody to read their sentences and be recorded. So I did that, and I did a theatre captioning as well, because I'd had the experience in television captioning, and library, applied to library work, and I kind of found I feel like it's my métier. I'm perhaps not a natural librarian, but I certainly enjoy it. I've been doing it 14 years or so, yeah, both at Bodleian and then 7 years at the British Library too, looking after the Tibetan collections. So using your knowledge and to a certain degree your experience, and yet yeah, it's a win-win for me, I think. You could put it that way, and getting paid. Yes. Yeah, so I very much enjoy it, and good people, really nice people.
And presumably you'd enrolled in Oxford with a view to completing a PhD or something like that.
Yes, that's true. Yes, I was going to do a PhD in Karma Pakshi, but finances kind of got in the way, and then I went and studied with Matthew Capstein in Paris for a bit, and sort of transferred the PhD to there, but I don't know, I just couldn't keep it up in a way. Time and money and studying, you really do need to have a grant. I don't think, people would say before, oh, you can't really work at the same time as doing PhD, and I think, well, why not, but I learned my lesson. Yeah, you can't really, you have to, so then it was a matter of writing a book about it, about the subject, Karma Pakshi. By then I'd done, a lot of the research for the subject, and it was just a matter of finding the time for writing, which also took a bit of time. But then, of course, there was the pandemic, so that sort of helped in a way, in terms of not being distracted quite as much. Yes.
What sort of things do you work on at the Bodleian and British Library? I mean, they're quite famous. British Libraries famously replete with cool stuff, cool text, Dun Huang stuff. Didn't was it what was his name? Not Stein.
Yes, Stein. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Are you working on that material?
Yeah. Well, I did a little project. It's a slightly different department, the IDP, International Dun Huang Program, but they did have the certain, I think it was about 400 documents hadn't been catalogued or registered in some way. I mean, they've got their numbers, but they hadn't been, yeah. And they had 6 months worth of money. So I did that for a while. So there am I sitting at a desk with these documents from 1,000 years ago. And not entirely casually, of course. You can't drink. Oh, it's really, you had to organize your toilet and your drinks and so forth. But yeah, you got a little bit, so, oh, this is 1,000 years old. Wow. And just doing that. So I did that, but that was just a 6 months project. Yeah. Otherwise, it can be quite banal. Buying books. At the moment, I'm doing quite a bit of looking through book lists to buy books. You get a certain budget and then cataloging them when they come in, the Tibetan language books. And you're working with other people to a certain degree. And they're such nice people to work with that it's quite smooth, really. I don't think I would do it if it was awkward. And very much that's in the British Library in the Bodleian. It's very much the same. I do look after the responsible for, I suppose, the manuscripts as well. I'm cataloguing. There was a donation by John Driver. Some of you may know the Tibetan Civilization book, written by R.A. Stein, a different Stein, Belgian. And John Driver translated it. Oh, there you go. You've got a copy. Yes. Yes. He was, he's recently died, 2016. He died, and his son, as a professor in London, he donated his collection to the Bodleian. And so, yeah, John Driver was in Tibet with his wife and child, not that son, he was born later, but in northern India, not Tibet, sorry, in northern India, in Nepal, in 1959, well, from 1958, perhaps. And so he was there when the Tibetans came out, so to speak. And he had collected his text largely before that time, as far as I understand. And so it's like a snapshot, in a way, of what was around at that time. This is before Gene Smith starts. So some of the texts, although TBRC, BDRC have it scanned for people who use the Tibetan a lot, and sometimes the scans aren't quite so good, and some of them we have at Bodleian, which is quite useful. And I'm coming towards the end of that. It's been on and off. COVID, you couldn't get into look at texts, but there's a catalogue called Karchak, Karchak, at Oxford, digital catalogue of it just really gives the titles of and the dimensions of the text, so people can find them there. But that's not finished yet, but I'm getting towards the end of hundreds of them. And also the regular, books published in China. You can imagine how many Tibetan books are published in China now. It's hard to keep up. And then also translations, the Western translations, publishers in the USA and Europe as well, and in India too. The monasteries are publishing quite a bit themselves. They're setting up, and you have to kind of try and keep track of that too. It's all books.
Yeah, well, that sounds pretty great, actually. I can barely keep track of my book buying. I
Right.
can only imagine how you must keep track of all that influx.
Yeah, you just tackle it as it comes in. Yeah. Yeah, it does. It's a little bit, you've always got backlogs and things. Yeah, it's sort of, it does hang in the back of your mind a bit, you know. Oh, this hasn't been done, that hasn't been done. But all you can do is just chip away at the coalface, yeah, and get it done as much as you can. I hope it's useful to the scholars. I think it's important that stuff gets preserved. These institutions are very good at preserving material. And these, you know, the internet, okay, it's quite exciting how you can be almost anywhere and read stuff, but it only takes the flick of a switch and it's off. So, and that has happened this 2 weeks ago in the British Library. We had a cyber attack and nobody can access their work. We've had our computers taken away to be reprocessed and all that, and made safe, but it doesn't take much. I suppose you could say, you know, with a library, all it takes is one match, and that's the end of it. But the internet isn't forever either. Nothing is forever.
Well, that's as we are often reminded
Yes.
by the Buddha himself.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, wow. Charles, this has been so great, so fascinating. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing your life here, sharing the story of your life here with on this podcast. It's been so wonderful.
Yeah.
Is there
Thank you.
anything else we ought to say or discuss or comment on before we bring this to an end?
Yeah. Well, people will make up their own minds, you know, who is this guy? What does he think he's doing? He's being selfish about this and all that. But that's as may be. What has happened recently with with publishing this book is that I give talks about it, and I've done on the east coast of USA, institutions largely, not so much Buddhist places. You know, libraries, university, TBRC, BDRC. I did Shambhala, the meditation center in Boston, but not the Buddhist places. And then back here, I did Bodleian and SOAS, again, institutions. So it's sort of more the historical side of it. And then Dirk de Klerk, who kindly, in the book, you'll see some music annotated of the Mani mantra, which I think, you know, is quite cool, but nobody seems to be terribly interested. But anyway, the he has a little meditation group locally at King's Cross, and he asked me to, you know, give some instruction or lead a day retreat. So I thought, well, when I've talked about Karma Pakshi, Karma Pakshi does mention this introduction to the 3 kayas or 4 kayas or even 5, but usually 3 or 4, quite a bit. And I've had 1 or 2 questions, people saying, well, what is this about? Well, you know, it's not in an institutional setting. Maybe it's not the time to go into I give a little bit of explanation. But I thought, why don't we actually do it, you know, in this day retreat? So we did. And it was slightly experimental in the sense that I didn't know what was going to, you know, whether it would be well received or not. It was just regular meditation, split up into short sessions. And apparently it was well received. So they've, you know, I do that once a month now there. And then the Buddhist Society next week going to give a talk. So it's a Buddhist center more about Karma Pakshi. So I'll angle it more towards the their interests, the audience's interests. And also we'll do some of the meditation as well. And likewise, going to go to Brussels and do it there again with the meditation. The talk will be online, but not the meditation. I think people may argue against it, but I think it's better not to. Better to do it only in person at the moment, anyway. And then in Germany too, Kamala Sheila, the place near Bonn, in Germany, and again, do the meditation thing. So I don't put myself as a meditation teacher, far from it. But I've sort of come into this a little bit, and we'll see how it goes. If people think it's wrong or shouldn't be doing it, then okay, I'll take that point of view. But at the moment, it does seem to be appreciated. So that's kind of what I'll carry on with the library work and do that as well. And eventually, maybe it'll get written down. But at the moment, I'd prefer it's early days, and just keep it as a in-person practical practice thing. I'm
wondering two things really. Why do you insist that you're not a meditation teacher? I'm curious about that. And also, I understand people in this area can get prickly about such things, but who might object to you teaching that?
I don't know. They might say, well, what's your lineage? Or whatever,
Then you can tell them, can't you?
Yes. Yes. But I don't know. It's people argue a lot in religious circles.
I've noticed that.
Yes. But in any circles, we're just humans. And that's kind of how if we are progressing, how we do progress, I suppose. By working things out. I'm mindful of the fact that somebody might find it odd or something. In which case, fair enough. I'm happy to discuss it. I'm not particularly wanting to push it, but I do feel that if it's beneficial, then it should be done. That's kind of my approach, really. And it did seem, the first time I didn't really want to do it in a way, but Dirk was quite insistent. So I did, and it seemed to work quite well. So let's pursue it for the time being and see what happens.
Yeah, thank you very much. This has been so wonderful. How can people get in touch with you? Of course, I'll include your contact details in the description of the episode below wherever it is. But how would you rather people contact you?
Yeah, well, if it's in terms of Tibetan texts and so forth, then I'm on the Bodleian. If you put in Bodleian, Oxford, Manson, you should get. Well, there are other Mansons, Manson Tibet or something. You know how Google finds people. There's a Bodleian email address there. So, but that's for that side of things, really. And I can't I don't have time to do research for people, but sometimes if people can't find things or they think something might be at the Bodleian, then I'll be perfectly happy to answer. I'm not so much on the British Library website, but there is Burkhard Kessel, if Tibetan website for the British Library. He's the curator, and we see each other regularly at work, and sometimes sort things out together. So just go to the website for anything to do with the British Library in terms of books or manuscripts. But and we do, we get both places. We get lamas visiting sometimes. But in terms of this book, I think just my personal, I put it on the various advertising things. Let's see, is there a card here? Yeah. I do sort of have a card thing, and the address is on there. It's cemanson@live.com. It's very simple. No, just CE Manson, all one word. And that's fine. I do maintain a couple of Facebook things for the Tibetan studies at SOAS and the Bodleian Library as well, which I think people look at a bit. It's about Tibetan matters, but I don't much, it's not a good way to get in touch, really, I don't think. Well, not a good, yeah, it's a fine way, but I'd rather if you wrote directly. If somebody has a query, I'd be happy to. Well, I hope I'd be happy to answer.
Willing, at least.
Yes, to a certain degree. Yeah, it's just it's the willingness is there. Sometimes time and difficulty is makes it difficult sometimes. I do. I've had help in various times. People being kind to me, and you have to keep that in mind, I think.
In terms of helping others, you mean?
Yeah. It's, I mean, in terms of, I can't find this, or, I'm looking for that, or what do you think I should read, this sort of thing. I'm never sure. They often don't come back, so I'm never sure whether the advice was any good. But certainly people have done it for me, and I actually, to think of it, I probably haven't gone back and said, "Oh, thanks very much." No, that's not true. Actually, yes, I have a couple of times, very deliberately, gone back and said, "That was really wonderful that you told me about that." And people are quite surprised sometimes how much an effect it had. And perhaps that happened. I don't know. Yeah. But I'm happy to communicate, given time and ability. I may not know something about something, and I'll just say so rather than give false information.
Charles Manson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.